Welcome for this special edition of the Mindfulnews Podcast. And on today's episode, we speak with podcast host, mindfulness leader and mentor, Ted Meissner.
There's an impression that, if I become mindful, I'll just always be calm and happy and everything is great and it's just butterflies and unicorn rainbows and all that. And that's not life. Stressors happen. And our ability to, and this is around the window of tolerance, that model of, are we in our window of tolerance? We're okay. We're in rest and recovery, or are we overwhelmed? And so in various groups like Gallup, did a survey and several other groups on what are some of the leading causes of burnout. And of the top 5, and I think a Gallup survey within the past 2 years, I think just a year ago as of this recording, all 5 of those conditions had nothing to do with us failing as people or a weakness of us. It had to do with conditions in the workplace. And that to me was very interesting. So in designing this course, it's not about how do we make you as the employee numb to the effects of burnout in your workplace? How do we give you the ability to check out and take a mental vacation throughout your day? It's not that. That's not mindfulness as I teach it. It's about turning towards what's here, and that can be difficult. So we do work on how do you take care of yourself first. Let's be cautiously optimistic because there is good science that is there that does show some influence of mindfulness on how people are in lots of different kinds of settings. The reason I'm cautiously optimistic is research that may show it's not as effective. Usually what I notice about those studies is they didn't have an actual program. We just had people randomly listening to meditation. So that's not quite what we do. It's more complicated than that. This is a discipline. And unfortunately, right now, mindfulness is not respected as a discipline. It's just a technique.
Ted has been hosting one of the most prolific and amazing podcasts on mindfulness and related topics for many years. And he's had on the who's who to share their insights and wonderful stories. So we turn the tables on Ted and put him in the hot seat. And we dig into his background in biology and his fondness of evolutionary theory, his incredible podcast called The Present Moment, with over 166 episodes, and his other Secular Buddhism podcast. We talk about his path to becoming a mindfulness teacher, the benefits of mindfulness, and how would we describe it to Klingons or Vulcans if visited? What is burnout? What is mindfulness? And lastly, what matters most to Ted? We also have a fun debate about the enthusiasm of mindfulness versus the science. Has science caught up with the enthusiasm? Also visit mindfulnews.uk for all of our podcasts, powerful video clips on our growing library of free inspiring guided meditations, including this week's latest release called The Mental Push-Up. I'm your host, Guy, on our continuing mission to help as many people organically. For some reason, the mic was having issues with my first question, but we quickly get that fixed, so do me a favor and bear with that. And if you enjoy the conversation and benefit from it, share it with someone and pay it forward. Well, thank you for joining. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and to a fellow podcaster, a fellow mindfulness. What's the word for someone that appreciates it and that, loves it and lives by it? I don't know what the word. The fact that you've been hosting a podcast on mindfulness for many, many years. And in fact, a little bit of information, a fun fact. When we last spoke in 2014, right? Wow. So that's going back a bit now. But 2014, you had 108 episodes and now 166. I did a quick check. Mm-hmm. So sorry, 2018 rather, not 2014. It was 2018. So there's a 4-year gap since our last interaction. For that first podcast, I'll put a link into the bio. So I think we really dug into your background and a little bit about you. So I think, and it was such a wonderful episode that I really encourage people, and as I put in the link to our first interaction when we first got together. So I would love to catch up and just find out, where is Ted now after all these years? So I know your podcast has continued to grow successfully. I don't know, at that time you were extremely knowledgeable, about mindfulness. You were teaching it, you were podcasting it, and had done so for many episodes. So my question is, in the last 4 years, how have things changed? As a mindfulness teacher and speaking with these experts and luminaries, how has that influenced your podcasting style? And how has that changed in the last 4 years? Why don't we start there?
Great question. Thank you. And again, so glad to be with you and to see how Mindfulnews has grown. It's just fantastic. I'm so happy for you in this transition we were talking about earlier with you.
Yeah.
And how it's
full time into mindfulness teaching and podcasting now, that corporate world is behind me.
Nice work if you can get it. Great place to be, particularly for people like us who this is something that is personally enriching of our lives, but being able to, in some way, influence the well-being of others. There's no, at least for me, there's no greater work. I know it's something to feel very similarly about.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there have been quite a number of changes over the past few years. And when we last spoke, it was pre-COVID, for example. And I think at the time I may have still been working at UMass Medical School at the Center for Mindfulness. So part of that trajectory, let's focus on podcasting for a few moments. We have two different podcasts. One is primarily focused on mindfulness. And a few years ago, I basically retired from podcasting. I wasn't doing a lot of episodes.
Really?
And to my surprise, because it's, as you know, it's a labor of love, and it would take a full day to schedule the interview, have the interviews, do the editing, all the rest of it. And
editing alone for me is a couple of days. Yeah, I know.
It takes a lot of time, and if you're also working a more than full-time job and teaching, it's just there's not enough room. And so I took a step back from that. We'll call it a mindful pause. Let's call it a mindful pause. And to my surprise, I took a look, because there are one or two episodes that I would do for people that I really wanted to share their work, or friends that I'd known for a long time, and let's have the conversation and put that out there. But still, after no real activity for a couple of years, it's over 5,000 downloads every month still.
Mm-hmm.
And
in the archive of your podcast, right?
Yeah, but they're all still out there, and clearly there's interest in this. And podcasting, I think, has grown a bit in the age of COVID.
Just a wee bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I've been very fortunate in doing is the decision I made a dozen years ago when I started podcasting with the Secular Buddhist, was to have these as interview format, so that I get to speak with wonderful people like you and others that have been guests over the years of over 400 episodes altogether.
Yeah.
And that's been wonderful. And that led to me taking the job, I think when we last spoke, at UMass Medical School at the Center for Mindfulness. I was their manager of online community and program development. And that was a wonderful place to be. My wife and I moved halfway across the country from Minnesota to Massachusetts. We are still there now. We're staying here. And then there was a shift then, as the center, as it had been as an international teacher training program leader in the field, closed their doors, and some of their work transitioned over to another part of UMass Memorial Healthcare. And my old job in the corporate world called me back and asked if I would come back, which was a wonderful thing and well-timed and certainly needed, because it was a surprise to lose that job that we'd moved for. And as you and I talked about last time, most of my work professionally has been in the corporate world. I'm an IT guy. And just a couple of years before you and I spoke, I had changed careers to teaching mindfulness. And I started that within one of the largest companies in the world in the corporate sector. Went to UMass for a few years and came back to teaching mindfulness in that corporate sector, as we were joining with another group, another sub company of this very large company. And now that's becoming part of another group. So I understand from what you'd shared about some of the transitions in your own life. Yep. Going through those right now and ongoing.
Okay.
And what I find fascinating is there is such an appetite, we'll call it, for mindfulness, and that it has so many potential benefits and so many opportunities for people in not just feeling better with existing stressors or depression or anxiety or whatever it is that they're going through, but also building some resiliency to those before they happen. And I'm just so very fortunate to be in a space where I can create programming that helps people in a context that is sometimes, at least there are impressions and views about it, that it is very insensitive, and it certainly can be. And where I am, I don't see that, and have been asked to create programs in areas where it is, as you had described before we started the podcast interview, that are maybe not as kind, maybe not as forward thinking. Yep. And no, I can't help you. It's not going to work because you're not interested in meaningful change to the conditions that are causing depression, anxiety, burnout, whatever it is. I'm teaching a course now on burnout, and that is more popular than any of the programs I've done in the past several years in the corporate sphere because of the need for it.
Yeah, let's dig into that a bit. So what is burnout? And I asked that question because I had shared with you before the podcast that I myself, both a mindfulness podcaster and a coach on how to be present. I don't know if I would describe it as a depression, but it was about a period of 2 weeks where I was really upset, couldn't get the stress of work out of my mind. I would apply the mindfulness techniques, but it was as soon as I back to the anchor, back to the breath, within a moment, the thought would regenerate, and so it was like exhausting. It was just constantly battling. Notice the thought, back to the anchor, but notice the thought. And every time it came, and then by the end of the day, my strength and my ability I would let it dwell a bit purely because I was exhausted of just always bringing it back. So how would you define burnout? Is it akin to what I'm describing?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because there's so many layers to this. Yeah. First thing we'll get to a kind of a working definition of burnout. Mm-hmm. But one of the things you describe is being human. Mm-hmm. And there's an impression that, if I become mindful, I'll just always be calm and happy and everything is great. And it's just butterflies and unicorn rainbows and all that. And that's not life. Stressors happen in life. Yeah. And this is around the window of tolerance, that model of, are we in our window of tolerance? We're okay. We're in rest and recovery, or are we overwhelmed? And anyone can get overwhelmed if the conditions are there to create that. Think about small aches and pains. I bump an elbow, or I stub a toe just a little bit, or a book falls on my finger or something like that. Not a big hurt, that'll pass, and there may be an ouch. And compare that to more severe injury, which will have a much higher level of pain. Even if you have been doing practices that help you change your relationship to pain, that sensation, that experience is still there. And when it is something that you have truly, deeply, personally committed to, as those of us who are passionate about the work that we do are, like you are as well, that shakes us to our core. So getting a little bit outside of our window of tolerance, a little bit through challenged and maybe into overwhelm, is not a wrong thing. It is your body, your mind, your heart telling you there's something going on and something to work with here. And you're able to process that a bit. And I think your mindfulness practice help keep that contained to a couple of weeks instead of maybe much longer time frame. Yep. So shifting over to burnout, it's fascinating. And putting this course together, I was asked by various business units. So I'm doing a regular mindfulness course, a 6-week course that we do there, and asked, well, we're going to do one more course. What would you like it to be about? And of the things that came in, the one that got the most interest was on burnout.
Interesting.
Okay. So that's happening. And we know in the world right now, as of this recording, burnout's a very big thing. In the United States, there's the big resignation. People are leaving jobs all over the place because they can.
And is burnout attributed as one of the main reasons?
Burnout's
is
one
it
of
up
the
there?
Causes.
Up there, yeah.
Yeah. And what we look at in forming this course and putting my business analyst hat on at the time was, okay, so with a mindfulness course on burnout, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's going on here? What do we know about burnout? So did some research on the research of burnout. And there are a few different ways you can look at it, and a number of different instruments that are used to measure what burnout is. And what I primarily landed on, so the definition I have here and what it includes is based on the work of Christina Maslach, and she created the MBI, the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And burnout is not just one thing. It can be several different things. It's not just there's too much to do and I'm tired. That's one aspect, which is the exhaustion aspect.
The physical,
Yeah, the physical, mental, emotional exhaustion.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Lots of different layers of that. There are other instruments that specifically measure that, and it breaks them into physical and mental and emotional. But there are a couple of other dimensions as well that might be showing up. Another one of those is efficacy. Am I enthusiastic about my job and there's not too much work, but I'm not able to be effective in it? And again, that's not a failing of you, the worker. It may be that you don't have the tools. It may be that the tools you're using are constantly changing and there's not adequate training on how to use them. Lots of different reasons, lots of different conditions that may be.
That sounds a little bit akin to that imposter syndrome a little bit.
Yeah, you might feel like I feel like I'm an imposter. For those who might not be familiar with what he's talking about, is the idea that I'm an imposter. I don't really know how to do this. I'm not very good at it, kind of thing. And
hands up. That's how I felt. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the territory of efficacy, and you may be very effective, and it's a perception that should be challenged. And of course, perception is a very big part of mindfulness. We do go into that in the programs.
Yeah.
That's a second dimension of that. Then a third dimension. And in full disclosure on this, because I'm open about, as a human being, I run into this too. I am also burned out in one of these domains. And I'm fine in the others, but one of them I'm burned out. The third of those is referred to as cynicism or engagement. So think about a context where there's not too much work to do. It's the right amount. You're challenged. It's not too much work for you to do. So there's not the exhaustion component. You're very effective at your job. You have the right tools. You know how to use them, or you don't have the right tools, but you're still really good at what you do. And the data shows that, yes, this is what you're doing is very effective, but you may not be engaged with your work. You may not be enthusiastic about your work. You may, in fact, be further on that scale, cynical about the workplace, maybe the people, maybe the work itself, maybe cynical about yourself. That's another dimension of burnout. And so in various groups, like Gallup did a survey and several other groups on what are some of the leading causes of burnout. And of the top 5, and I think a Gallup survey within the past 2 years, I think just a year ago as of this recording, all 5 of those conditions had nothing to do with us failing as people or a weakness of us. It had to do with conditions in the workplace. And that to me was very interesting. So in designing this course, it's not about how do we make you as the employee numb to the effects of burnout in your workplace. How do we give you the ability to check out and take a mental vacation throughout your day? It's not that. That's not mindfulness as I teach it. It's about turning towards what's here. And that can be difficult. So we do work on how do you take care of yourself first. And then we go into how do we move the needle on the conditions that are leading to burnout in the first place. And by the end of the course, not only do people have some grounding in mindfulness practice, an introduction to that, but also come away with a personal action plan. Here's how I'm going to work with it. And it's not one action plan for everybody. It's based on your personal experience with it, because I might be burned out in one territory or 2 or 3, but you might have a totally different experience and reason why you're burned out. So part of it is learning about, okay, I am feeling burnout, or I anticipate I might be. How can I build my resiliency? How do I move the needle on the conditions with burnout?
I think interestingly for me, it's like I had zero passion in the role that I was doing. Software and IT, it means to an end. And I love the people and the culture and etc. But it was always about helping others and through mindfulness and through podcasting. So I think a big part of that burnout was like, I'm not passionate about what's going on here, and the work that was being asked of me and the time that was being asked of me. It was just, so I really appreciate those insights. So which leads to my next question then. So again, back to that, since we last spoke kind of a conversation in these past 4 years, what is mindfulness? How would you describe mindfulness Now, we can, textbook, if you were to say, like, for students, here you go, here's mindfulness. Or for, you're about to go into the corporate world and the leader of HR says, all right, Ted, give me the top 5 reasons why I should be interested in mindfulness, right? But I'm asking more now, like on your deathbed, or, you're writing a letter to a relative or to the future generations. We send this out into space and, we got it locked in a box, and Ted's talking about the benefits, or what is mindfulness? What would you say? What would you want that legacy to be, right? And if it's not just to the corporate world or to the education system, or this is for you, what is mindfulness, right? Because like when I spoke with John Kabat-Zinn, we was talking about how, well, what is quantum mechanics to an expert, right? Now, he may put it in a way which means zero to everyone else that listens to it, because there's an element of, well, to really understand what I need to say, you need to have understood this, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And once you understand it, then you can start to understand where I'm coming from. So what is mindfulness to you, in that this is like 100 years time, aliens find this and they look at the note that you've left for future generations. Can you just share some insight, having, all your deep insights?
Yeah. And my hope is that the aliens are Vulcans, honestly, because they really benefit from this definition, I think. I think it's a wonderful question, Vicky, because it is a very personal thing. And yet, as human beings, there are shared experiences that are in the same territory. It's unique to you, and others also feel things like this. Mm-hmm. So the way I would, as a legacy way of sharing it, is showing up with care. And I want to dig into that a little bit. The showing up, that's an active verb that's starting with an action, with something that you need to take on with intention. Showing up is being here right now. It's not show up like once, it's showing up. It's a continual thing that we do. One of the challenges that I see happening a lot, and you've seen some of the conversations that have been occurring on LinkedIn and posts that I have on various researches and things like that, and especially popular journal articles that get things wrong, is that mindfulness continues to be characterized by many as taking a break or as techniques. And the challenge with that is, if you have a technique, something in a toolkit that you bring out, oh, I'm going to do my 10 minutes of meditation today and then I'm done being mindful, we're missing something there. And that is the integration of those mindful presence, the showing up with care, into the rest of your day. And so when there are programs that are, you compare a program with a trained teacher to, well, we had people listening to random meditations. Well, of course, it's not going to be as effective, and it takes time. This is like exercise. So showing up with care, it's not just bare attention. There's also how you are when you show up. And I mean with care in a few different ways, as in being careful. What is the most appropriate response I can give to this moment? That kind of way of looking at care, but also with care on a personal, emotional level, with caringness, with being filled with care for self and others. And you'll notice that's not a list of thou shalt nots. It's not prescriptions. It is a framework that has flexibility about whatever it is that's coming up. So that's how I would define it, as showing up with care, off the top of my head.
This podcast is sponsored by Be Present Coaching, upskilling business professionals with mindfulness tools. Check out bepresent.uk for more information on corporate courses and guided mind exercises. Okay, so let me double down on that then. So again, in this eternal message you're sharing to, future generations, moving forward, what are the top benefits of mindfulness?
Yeah, so I gave the what and the how, and now maybe the why.
Yeah, so if your grandmother or your children, or insert anything, humankind, right?
I'm still going to go with Vulcans. That's all right. So
I'm more a Klingon,
So why do we do this? Yeah, why do we do this? Or okay, we'll go with the Klingons. It still applies as living.
But yeah, so and the reason why, before, I'll caveat this by saying that as I've evolved in my mindfulness journey, it's stress reduction. but then it opened up into so much more, right? So, I'll allow you the opportunity to answer, but I mean, I'd be very keen for you if again, how we speak to corporate and how we speak to teachers and students, but let's put that all aside. And you've got 3 or 4 things to list down as the benefits of mindfulness to eternalize, immortalize. Give me some insight as to where does your mind go when that question's thrown at you?
It tends to go deep, and that comes from just my own experience, which is felt and lived every day after 30 some years of practice and many, many years of teaching and being a trainer and
amazing conversations with these amazing experts, right? That every time you get the fortunate experience of oh, that's another gem and that's another gem. And perhaps sometimes you don't even realize it, but there's just maybe there's these underlying messages that remain true all the way that kind of solidifies. And maybe after a while, you just think it's normal, but it's actually the result of these fantastic opportunities for insight and learning from these luminaries.
That's the wonderful thing about having done the podcasting and continuing to do that, because I have started up again with some recordings, is I feel like these gems, these treasures that you mention, they come from others and fantastic people who've been doing this a long time and have tremendous insights to share. So I'm in the fortunate place of being smog on a hoard of gems and jewels and gold that are all right here. And it's always all right here. Yeah. But with their insights, able to see it. And I think that's the biggest benefit. The first and foremost, and this is a bit of a two-edged sword, is the biggest benefit is seeing yourself more clearly. And when I first started that, seeing myself more clearly was not a pleasant experience. It was noticing how manipulative, selfish, angry, difficult, problematic, and hurtful to the people around me that I loved. Yeah. And it can also be, and that's not the totality of me. There are also other aspects of who I am and who I can choose to be. Yeah. So the ability to see oneself is with a wider context of not just what the inner critic might be saying, but also what our minds may be doing to distract us from seeing things we need to change about ourselves.
So can I add, does that mean you've lived a life not seeing yourself clearly? This is kind of where I'm getting
yes.
at, right?
Yeah,
because
until the point in my 20s, it was not. In fact, I will say willful ignorance about how I was with other people.
Yeah.
And facing those. So, for example, and for the listeners too, maybe raise your hand if you've ever said something you didn't really mean or you later regretted. I'm doing that too. Many of us have. I suspect most of us have, if not everyone. And there are moments where, that happens, that comes through. What I saw about myself was most of my time, most of how I was not encouraging, was not building people up. It was knocking them down, coming from my own pain and history of trauma and all the rest of that stuff that had not been seen, that had also been avoided because the culture at the time and my upbringing was to avoid and suppress, which is the opposite of mindfulness. So without that being able to see what is here right now, without being able to see myself more clearly, it's much, much easier. I had a very strong habit of...
Exactly. So let me stop you there. So that means you lived a life not seeing yourself right there and right now. And I think when I phrase it like that, it starts to add a bit more. If you're saying that not being able to see yourself, that means, well, what have you done your whole life? And I think that's the key thing there. It's for the whole life, you haven't seen. Now that is important. That is significant.
Yes.
Because when I spoke in my last podcast with Vidyamala Birch, she very well known in the mindfulness world, specifically as it relates to chronic pain. One of the comments made that through mindfulness is she was fortunate enough to get introduced to her mind. And then so I raised the point, does that mean you lived your life not knowing your mind? And I think, when you say that, not being able to see yourself right here, right now, what does that mean? You've lived your life not ever seeing yourself right there, right now? Or maybe sporadically, but
mostly not. And moments...
So when I get into the benefits, I'm really starting to dig down. It's not only are we realizing it now, but almost been a crime. It's been criminal that we've lived our life not, right? And I think that's where I'm going. So please go on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. It is just a crying shame that we're not able to see ourselves and
haven't been taught that. Right. Because
not specifically taught never look at yourself. Not that.
Yeah.
My parents are very good about, you could be anything you want to be. You get to choose based on their upbringing and not having as many choices. And then passing on to their children, you do have more options. And also seeing behaviors in just generally in living where avoidance is the thing. Comedian Bill Burr has a show.
I saw him live in Wembley 2 years ago.
Yeah.
No, sorry, at the O2. Sorry, not in Wembley, in the O2. I love Bill Burr. I love Bill.
In this cartoon show that he does, there's one moment that it still stands out to me where
F is for family. Yep.
F is for family. Yep. Exactly. Yep. And one of his kids is upset about something, and Bill's character says, "Oh no, take those feelings and just squish them down, crush them into," and like that's
be a man.
For most people, we were raised.
Be a man, squish them down.
Exactly, and that was a disservice, especially to the kid who was very sensitive and dealing with trauma stuff that was going on.
Yes.
So being able to see that an outcome of that, because that's one of the tap roots of mindfulness, is this clearer seeing of yourself, not having to be perfect about it, but clearer, is recognizing, here's where the choices I've made or the habits that I have where I am mindless and not intentionally choosing my response, but being reactive, leads to, suffering or not so good outcomes.
Yeah.
Here's where, when I'm existing in a state of anxiety, I don't know what to do about it. Where I am experiencing a depression or a mental loop, or my inner critic is just beating the crap out of me, I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And with mindfulness, there are learned ways to be with that, to turn towards them, which is against the grain. Absolutely against the grain, to turn towards unpleasant or the unwanted. And yet in mindfulness, that's where a tremendous strength comes from, in seeing that and doing so in a manner that's not harmful.
Yeah.
And that's part of the learning with, and especially the work of David Treleaven, especially in trauma-sensitive mindfulness, and why teacher training is so important. It's not just, here, listen to some meditations. Like, wait, what are we trying to accomplish here? Are those the right things? Is this the right time? Is there benefit to having some structure around this and support and greater understanding about what we're doing, not just checking out with, I'm going to go to my happy place. And there's nothing wrong with taking a break and taking a step back now and then. That's fine. You need to do that. Of course, that's to recharge. And that can also become avoidance, suppression, spiritual bypassing, and is another word that comes up for it. We're like, I feel great when I'm meditating. And yet those conditions that lead us to maybe not be our best selves might still be present. Mindfulness helps us see that more clearly and gives the option to work with them and maybe move that needle a bit in how we are.
So what I'd love to have a debate with you about right now, and purely because I know you love the science, and I know you're regularly posting articles that come out on LinkedIn. One expression that I was introduced to early on in my mindfulness days is the idea of this enthusiasm of mindfulness not keeping up with the science, or the science not keeping up with the enthusiasm. And then for me, since we last spoke, I've kind of gone the other way, in the idea that science has not caught up to the enthusiasm. Right. So before I elaborate on that, I'd love to get your take on that first, and then I'll chime in after that. So this idea of enthusiasm versus the science, and the kind of, some people are like, all there with the enthusiasm. Some people are all there with the science. And where are you? And let's have a fun conversation about that.
Well, it's a great topic. Thanks for introducing this as an idea and something for us to unpack. Is that there are different ends of the spectrum on this. There are different attitudes and poles. For some, it's mindfulness is,
and I'm not saying there's a right and wrong. I'm just purely just like, let's
what are we seeing? What's the territory?
Yeah. In your massive research,
Yeah, for those who might not be as familiar with it, we might see research where, mindfulness is great for XYZ, and science has proven something. And that's not how science works. Science is tentative. Science is predictive. Science changes as we learn more. And that's one of the great things about the scientific method, is it doesn't have ideology. Science is just a method for us to learn about the natural world. That's it.
Yeah.
And for some, we may see research. There, I think, currently over 8,000, at least over 7,000 studies around mindfulness.
And exponentially growing.
So it's just keeps going up. So again, thanks to David Black for yearly posting on goamra.org, the chart that shows the number of studies, and it does keep.
Oh, really? What's that called?
GoAmra, GoAmra.org. And if you look at their resources library, you'll see a big chart.
Okay.
And it's a bar chart that just
mindfulness studies,
number of studies for basically the past 40 years.
Okay.
And within that, and I always describe this in classes that I teach as there's some really, really good science in there with active control groups. So it's not just a null group, a wait list of people who took an intervention pre and post, and then a control group where they did nothing whatsoever. Being in some sort of interaction, some social group, and doing the work, there's going to be an attitude with that. It comes with, well, I did the work. I should see something out of it. That is part of it. And good science will also have an active control so we can get more closely as we can get to what's the active ingredient here. So there's placebo pills, but they still have people taking the sugar pills to see. There are groups that, we don't have them taking any sugar pills at all. We need to see that. So one end of the spectrum is science is great and it's so strong and it proves all of this. I always, when I see the word prove, a red flag goes up for me because that's not how science works. Now, the other end of the spectrum is just denial, where any opportunity to say mindfulness doesn't work. In fact, it was about a month or two ago, I posted, I never received as many hits in my Google alerts than this particular article and research that came out around popular journal articles said mindfulness doesn't work in teenagers. And that showed up. I had like 5 hits a day for like 2 weeks on this thing. And that's not at all what the research said. Not at all. But the popular articles misrepresented it. And so there was this denialism, and then work by the mindful cranks is always in a state of not knowing what we actually do in mindfulness courses, would say, this doesn't work. This is bad stuff. So within that, where might I fit? And it kind of depends on, what's the particular research we're seeing? What's the popular journal article say about it? Is it responsible journalism that is accurate in what their title is instead of clickbait? I'm seeing a lot of clickbait recently, and I understand that there are selective pressures for journalists, for outlets to do that. I get it, and I still think it's wrong. I think it's ethically incorrect. Where I fit into this is, let's be cautiously optimistic, because there is good science that is there that does show some influence of mindfulness on how people are in lots of different kinds of settings. The reason I'm cautiously optimistic is research that may show it's not as effective. Usually what I notice about those studies is they didn't have an actual program. They just had people randomly listening to meditation. So that's not quite what we do. It's more complicated than that. This is a discipline. And unfortunately, right now, mindfulness is not respected as a discipline. It's just a technique. You learn how to be mindful. I can show you that in 5 minutes. That's not what us who are responsible teachers do. It's more complicated than that. Or they'll do research and they'll have a program that was designed, quotey fingers here. If you're just listening, I'm doing the quotey fingers here, designed not by a mindfulness teacher. So there are some pretty obvious gaps or misses that were part of that.
Yes.
So as an example, and this is many years ago, I interviewed the researcher on this. I'm very grateful to them for coming on the podcast about it. There was a paper that said, mindfulness doesn't work. And they had posted in their research, here's what we did as the intervention on the one side, but not on the other. What was your control? And so I reached out to them and what I found, and they did share some of this in their limitations of the study. They really missed the boat, is they had people listening to a variety of mindfulness recordings for their intervention group. So every day, people in this intervention group, the mindfulness group, would get a different meditation. And we don't do that because that's confusing. That's like saying we're going to train for a marathon. Today we're doing calisthenics. Tomorrow we're going to lift weights. And then the next day we're going to lift weights, different weights. We're going to do the legs instead of the quads. And then we're going to do this other stuff. And eventually maybe we'll do a little bit of running.
Yeah.
You're not going to have a very good marathon. And their control group, which had better responses, they just got one, what they called sham meditation, which they didn't include in the paper. I said, can you send me that sham meditation? They sent me that sham meditation was actually an awareness of breath meditation. So their control group got not a sham, an actual meditation, and it was the same one. So the people who were using that got to be familiar with it, became comfortable with that, and got to actually go a little deeper with the exercise than people who were constantly having their brains rattled around doing different things. So of course, that was a predictable outcome if they'd had a mindfulness person take a look at the structure of their study, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And we see that happening all the time where groups well-intentioned, well, what's this look like? Or they'll do meta-analysis and not do actual research themselves on different, so they'll look at other people's work, but that often does not include, were the teachers well-trained? Or were they people who are not mindfulness teachers who were given scripts? That doesn't have the same effect as having someone who can be there and know what they're actually doing. If you're reading someone else's words, you are not authentically connecting with that, and people pick up on that, and then they can't authentically connect with it.
Yeah.
So it was also just a shout out to Nicholas Van Dam and all the other co-authors on the Mind the Hype article, which I was very fortunate to be part of and contribute a little bit to, that really shared, here's some of the things we know about mindfulness, here's some of the things that we don't, here's some good indications. And yeah, more research is needed, not because we didn't find anything, but because we need to understand more what we are finding and raise the bar on our research protocols.
Whilst we're on this topic, where can our listeners and viewers go to find the paper that you just mentioned, this article, and find out more about you? Let's take this opportunity to kind of share
so the
information.
So if you want to find me, actually, I'd recommend, if you're looking for up-to-date stuff, find me on LinkedIn. That's a good spot because I'm regularly posting on that. Hardly a week goes by that I'm not putting something out there and involved in a conversation. So LinkedIn is a good place to find me. For the podcast,
so Ted Meissner on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah,
and I'll include links to this website. Do you use Instagram, Twitter, anything, or is it mainly?
I have a Twitter account. I haven't been using that stuff much. I'm really limiting to the podcast a little bit, and that's present.
Your website, which is
presentmomentmindfulness.com, is where people will find the podcast episodes, and that's on.
And LinkedIn, what do we search for?
Yeah, LinkedIn, and those are the two main things. That's
Ted Meissner, and spell Meissner for our listeners.
Ted Meissner,
Meissner,
Meissner.
Yep.
And for that Mind the Hype article, if you go to presentmomentmindfulness.com, just do a search on Mind the Hype. I think I have the article linked there, or you can just do a Google search on Mind the Hype mindfulness.
Link in the bio.
You will see that, and it is available, and you should be able to take a look at that.
Yeah. So just a couple of ending questions then. How would you rate your happiness out of 10 on a day-to-day? You would say.
Well, generally speaking, pretty good.
Give me a number. Give me a number out of 10.
Of 1 to 10?
Yeah, in the last month, on average, if you were to,
well, last month is rather unique because one of our beloved pets is not doing well, and we're having to say goodbye. So this past month, not a
good representation. Okay,
not a good representation. Generally speaking, probably.
Give me general. Yeah.
Generally speaking, probably around an 8.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that's with being completely burned out in one of those dimensions. Myself and work, as it is for you, is very important to me because it's helping people. It is the best work that I can do, and I'm very fortunate to be doing that. So it impacts how I'm feeling to be burned out in one of those dimensions, and working on the conditions to change those things that are leading to burnout in the first place. But generally speaking, around an 8.
Yeah.
In prior to mindfulness, no, not that high. At most, I would peak at around 6s because I didn't know how to work with the distress that was already in my life.
The suffering.
Causing and perpetuating ongoing.
Yeah. So one final question for you, Ted. Well, I asked it last time when I listened back to your response, so I'll be keen to see the evolution in this answer. But, what matters most for you?
Again, the echoes of depth. So the pause is not.
Please, no, I would love you to reflect.
It's one of depth of the question, because it is a great question.
And again, if someone were to open the Klingons or the Vulcans, or in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time, 1,000,000 years' time, and they, what mattered most? Ted?
I find it a little odd to give this particular answer as someone who is an introvert and is recharged by solitude, and likes nothing better than to go solo camping or doing my formal practice by myself. I'd say the most important thing is connection. And again, there are many different layers to that word connection. For many, it may be a nourishing connection with others, with nature, with, in my case, yourself or people you love. And John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli have both described mindfulness as a radical act of love. And to me, there is no truer statement there. The way I'm characterizing that, with great thanks and credit to them, is because love has lots of different connotation, lots of different baggage, can actually be triggering for many of us. Connection is another way to share that may not have the same challenges and some of the speed bumps that love itself might. So I'd say for me, the most important is connection in whatever way is appropriate for you, where you are at this particular moment in your life.
Yeah. Well, Ted, thank you. Another epic conversation. Hopefully we won't have to wait 4 years until our next interaction. But, I'm a massive follower on the podcast, on LinkedIn. And, you've been an inspiration for me. And I've lacked consistency as well. And everyone says the key for a successful podcast is consistency. So I would, recommend, please keep doing what you're doing. Please keep them regular. There are people that love what you do. I'm one of those people. And, it inspires me now. Since my redundancy that we spoke of, my aim is one podcast a week, whether it's an amazing guest or me giving a guided meditation or something. But I want to keep this regular. And, I'm a big fan and just so thankful for you taking the time to come and have a chat with me today. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad to see that your work is getting the attention it deserves and that you're able to focus on that. It's so wonderful to hear and good to speak with you again.
Thanks for making it this far and showing your support and love to the podcast. A big thanks again to Be Present Coaching for their support. Find out more about their masterclass mindfulness courses and free guided meditations at bepresent.uk. bepresent.uk. I'm your host, Guy, and this is the Mindfulnews Podcast. If you've taken away something from today's episode, please go ahead and share the link with a friend. Until next week.